move straight on to today's business news. Here on set with me is Yuka Roy, and Argentina has avoided defaulting on its debt repayment, hasn't it, Yuka?
Well, a sigh of relief, really, for Buenos Aires. It has reached a deal with its international creditors to avoid defaulting on about $2.4 billion worth of debt repayment at the end of July. That's when a grace period would have expired. Instead, Argentina will repay just $430 million in the short term and the rest next year. The tranche was the last repayment of debt negotiated with the so-called Paris Club of Creditors back in 2014. Separately, though, the country will continue negotiating the repayment of around $44 billion it borrowed from the International Monetary Fund. Here's Argentina's economy minister announcing that deal.
Paying that amount would have been a blow to our international reserves and therefore would have generated more exchange rate instability and more macroeconomic instability in general. Argentina will have time until March 31st, 2022 to aim for a more permanent restructuring plan with the Paris Club.
Now, the head of the US Federal Reserve has given his reassurances that the recent rise in inflation is just temporary and will wane. Not everybody is convinced, though.
Well, there have been a lot of jitters lately since consumer prices in the United States jumped 5% last month compared to a year earlier, the highest rise in 13 years. Jerome Powell told Congress that he believed the high inflation levels that we are currently seeing were linked to the post-lockdown economic reopening and would settle closer to the long-term goal of around 2% eventually. A market analyst earlier told us that there's doubt over whether Powell's official comments give the whole picture.
Despite Powell's reassurances, I think the Fed dot plot that we saw from last week's meeting tells us a different story. I mean, the fact that enough of Powell's colleagues are penciling in not just one, but two U.S. interest rate hikes by 2023 is in stark contrast to the expectations that we had coming into this year. So I think market participants are now viewing the Fed's commentary with a new lens, so to speak, given what we have learned from last week's Fed meeting.
Well, financial markets did welcome Powell's remarks. Wall Street shares ended Tuesday on a positive note, with the Nasdaq again reaching a record high. Asian markets also showing gains. Hong Kong shares recovered from Tuesday's loss, up about 1.5%. Tokyo near flatline, but that comes after a 3% rise in the previous session.
Now let's move to a controversial move by the world's largest investment bank.
Well, that's Morgan Stanley. The bank has reportedly decided not to allow staff and clients to enter its New York offices unless they are fully vaccinated. Employees who are not fully immunized will have to work remotely. The new policy will come into effect next month, and in return, some COVID restrictions that are currently in place will be lifted. It comes days after the bank's CEO called on staff to come back to the office.
Now we're going to talk about Google on the programme. It's facing another antitrust probe. It's here in Europe over its all-important online advertising business.
Well, the European Commission has launched a fresh investigation into whether the US tech giant is restricting access by third parties to user data. This comes after the EU already slapped the company with more than €8 billion in fines in 3 separate antitrust cases. Separately, though, Google has won its largest copyright infringement challenge involving context, posted on YouTube. Sharon Gaffney reports.
Google is facing a fresh probe by EU anti-competition regulators over concerns that the tech giant is forcing out rivals in digital advertising technology.
Our investigation will focus on display advertising, where Google offers a number of services both to advertisers and publishers.
Google generated €124 billion in revenue from online ads last year. The European Commission is to look into whether the tech giant distorts competition by restricting third-party access to user data for advertising purposes, while reserving such data for its own use. Google says it will cooperate with the inquiry. In a statement, it said its advertising products were used because they're competitive and effective. Brussels has already imposed fines of more than €8 billion on Google over the past decade, following 3 separate antitrust cases for blocking rivals in online shopping and digital advertising. Separately, Europe's top court has ruled in favour of Google's YouTube on a copyright case involving content uploaded to online platforms, saying they cannot be held liable unless they fail to take speedy action to remove or block access to the content. The case is part of a wider debate about how much such platforms should do to police the posting of illegal or hateful content, an area EU regulators are targeting with tough new rules that could come into force next year.
Yeah, the latest problems there for Google. Thanks very much, Jukka. Jukka with Business on France 24.